Most wars are remembered for the worlds they conquer and the enemies they destroy, but history rarely asks a far more complex question. What was the point if nothing lasting can be built from the ashes? What happens when bolters fall silent? What happens after the war is won? What happens is the Ultramarines. For 10,000 years, they have stood as the most recognizable face of the Adeptus Astartes. To countless billions across the Imperium, they are the pinnacle of what a Space Marine is supposed to be. Their Primarch reshaped the Imperium in the wake of its greatest disaster. His teachings became the foundation upon which the majority of chapters would organize themselves. Their gene seed is regarded as among the purest ever created, and more chapters trace their lineage to the Ultramarines than to any other of the Emperor's original legions. But despite all of this, they have spent decades burdened beneath a scathing reputation that could scarcely be more undeserved. To many, the Ultramarines are nothing special, the quintessential generic Space Marine, warriors remembered not for who they are, but for their predictability or for how often they appear. However, the truth is rather different, and it is far more interesting. Each of the original Space Marine legions embodied a different philosophy of war. The Night Lords spread terror, the Imperial Fists mastered fortification, the World Eaters unleashed slaughter, the Raven Guard struck from the shadows, the Space Wolves carried out the Emperor's judgment. But the Ultramarines represented something else entirely. Though every bit as capable of waging total war as any of their brother legions, the Sons of Guilliman are notable not only for how they conquered, but for what they left behind. They sought to govern, not just occupy, transforming conquered worlds into fully functioning realms. It was this philosophy that shaped Ultramar into one of the most prosperous domains in the Imperium, and it was the same philosophy that would prove indispensable when the Horus Heresy shattered the Emperor's dream. As the Imperium stood on the brink of collapse, it was Guilliman who helped hold it together, laying the foundations that would endure for the next 10,000 years. Yet, perhaps the greatest irony of all is that the chapter so often dismissed as unimaginative has one of the richest and most influential legacies in Imperial history. They are warriors, certainly, but they are also rulers, scholars, governors, diplomats, and custodians of an ideal. To understand the Ultramarines is to understand far more than the Imperium's most famous chapter. It is to understand why, in a galaxy consumed by endless war, some victories need to be measured not by battles won, but by what remains when the conflict has ceased. And to understand why that ideal has been so wholly embraced by the Ultramarines, we must first begin with their legendary Primarch, and the civilization he would one day build. Every Primarch became remembered for a defining quality. Sanguinius is nobility, Angron is rage, Conrad Kurz is fear, Roboute Guilliman is order. Not the cold, oppressive order of a tyrant, but the belief that through reason and careful leadership, even the greatest challenges facing humanity can be overcome. It is a philosophy that assumes societies can be strengthened through justice, and civilizations can endure beyond the lives of those who built them. Sadly, Guilliman would come to inhabit a galaxy where reason alone was never enough. A galaxy where many of his own brothers would abandon reason entirely in the pursuit of ambition, vengeance, or madness. But despite all of that, Guilliman never stopped trying to solve problems. Like all of the Emperor's sons, Guilliman was scattered across the galaxy by the ruinous powers of chaos before he could ever come to know his true father. His gestation capsule came to rest upon the distant world of Macragge, a harsh but civilized planet whose people valued discipline, honor, and duty above all else. He was discovered by Connor, one of Macragge's 2 ruling consuls, who took the infant Primarch into his household and raised him as his own son. Unlike many of his brothers whose childhoods were defined by slavery, violence, or survival against impossible odds, Guilliman grew up surrounded by statesmen, scholars, and soldiers. Alongside Connor, he was guided by Tarasha Uton, the chamberlain of his household, whose wisdom and unwavering honesty would become instrumental in shaping the young Primarch's character. While Connor taught Guilliman how to lead, Tarasha taught him how to listen. Far more than a servant, she she became one of the young Primarch's closest advisors and fiercest critics, refusing to be intimidated by his extraordinary intellect or growing authority. Where others saw an almost perfect being destined for greatness, Tarasha saw a son who still had very much to learn. She challenged his assumptions, questioned his decisions, and expected humility as readily as excellence. In doing so, she gave Guilliman something many of his brothers would never truly possess. Someone willing to speak honestly to him, not because of his power, but in spite of it. Even as a child, Guilliman displayed abilities far beyond those of any ordinary human. He learned with astonishing speed, mastering multiple languages, military theory, history, mathematics, and philosophy in only a fraction of the time any normal man required. What's more, he immersed himself in the histories of civilizations long vanished, seeking to understand not only how these kingdoms were built, but why they ultimately fell. Under Connor's guidance, he studied every aspect of governance: law, economics, diplomacy, administration, logistics. He learned that armies alone could conquer a world, but that only stable government, fair justice, and competent leadership could keep it from total collapse. These experiences instilled within Guilliman a conviction. A great ruler should not build kingdoms that depend upon themselves alone. A single exceptional leader might secure peace for a generation, but institutions, laws, and traditions could preserve it for centuries. Throughout his life, Guilliman would return to this principle time and again, seeking to build systems that ordinary men could inherit, strengthen, and one day pass on themselves. Yet, Macragge was far from peaceful. Political ambition lurked beneath its orderly exterior, and when Guilliman was still a young man, Connor was assassinated by his fellow consul, Gallen, who sought to destroy Connor's populist reforms and seize total control of the planet. The murder of his adopted father plunged Macragge into civil conflict, forcing Guilliman to prove that his talents extended beyond scholarship. He responded with remarkable decisiveness, leading loyal forces with the same careful planning and measured judgment that had characterized his education. Guilliman crushed the rebellion, restored stability to Macragge, and ensured that those responsible for his adoptive father's death were brought to justice. Yet victory was never pursued for vengeance alone. Once order had been restored, Guilliman turned immediately to rebuilding the institutions that had been threatened by corruption and ambition, strengthening Macragge so that such treachery could not so easily endanger it again. Under his leadership, Macragge flourished like never before. Prosperity rippled across the world, commerce expanded, infrastructure improved, and his people enjoyed a level of stability and security that few worlds within the galaxy would ever rival. His people did not simply obey him, he was beloved by them. It was into this thriving realm that the Emperor of Mankind finally arrived during the Great Crusade. Recognizing his son immediately, and all that he had already achieved, the Emperor revealed Guilliman's true origins and welcomed him to the ranks of his lost brothers. Unlike many of the Primarchs whose first meetings with their father were marked by suspicion, resentment, or conflict, Guilliman accepted both his heritage and the responsibility that accompanied it without hesitation. Out of all of the Emperor's lost sons, Guilliman arrived already possessing something that the Great Crusade desperately needed: a master administrator capable of transforming victory into lasting stability. He left Macragge not as a reluctant conqueror, but as a ruler entrusted with a far greater realm than he could have ever imagined. But the Imperium he inherited was vastly larger than Macragge, and it would prove infinitely more difficult to govern. With his son restored to him, the Emperor placed Guilliman at the head of the 13th Legion. Like all of the original Space Marine legions, the 13th had existed long before its Primarch was rediscovered. Its warriors had already fought extensively throughout the earliest years of the Great Crusade, where they had demonstrated a remarkable ability to prosecute almost any form of warfare. Rather than mastering a single method, the Ultramarines sought mastery of war itself, believing that no battlefield should dictate how they fought. It was after their Primarch took command, however, that the Legion truly found its identity. Where many of his brothers shaped their legions in the image of their own personalities, Guilliman transformed the 13th into an extension of the principles and systems he had developed and refined upon Macragge. Military success and responsible governments were not separate pursuits, but different expressions of the same philosophy. A conquered world that immediately descended into rebellion, famine, or disaster could scarcely be labelled a true victory at all. As the Great Crusade swept ever onwards, the Ultramarines brought a great many worlds into Imperial compliance. Wherever possible, they sought to leave behind functioning governments and restored infrastructure capable of supporting the Greater Imperium long after the Legion had departed. They were astonishingly effective. With each successful campaign, the realm of Ultramar steadily expanded as newly compliant worlds were incorporated into Guilliman's growing domain. This prosperity proved invaluable to the 13th Legion. While many of the Emperor's legions drew recruits from only a handful of worlds, the Ultramarines benefited from the largest and most stable recruiting population in the Imperium. Their realm's strength provided a constant flow of suitable aspirants, while the remarkable purity and stability of Guilliman's gene seed ensured that new warriors could be created with exceptional reliability. Combat losses that might have crippled other legions could be replaced far more readily by the sons of Guilliman. This growth was all the more remarkable because the 13th Legion had not always enjoyed such strength. Before their Primarch's rediscovery, devastating losses during the Great Crusade had brought the Legion close to ruin. The Legion's own methods further reinforced this growth. Its organization emphasized discipline, standardization, and clear chains of command, allowing the Ultramarines to absorb new recruits and wage campaigns across multiple fronts without sacrificing cohesion. By the closing years of the Great Crusade, the Ultramarines numbered approximately 250,000 Space Marines, making them the largest of all the Legiones Astartes. But their reputation extended far beyond their sheer numbers. Across the Imperium, they became renowned for their flexibility, competency, and professionalism, capable of adapting to almost any battlefield, while maintaining the logistical and administrative excellence required to sustain campaigns on such a colossal scale. This was no accident. The 13th Legion had become the military expression of Guilliman's greatest belief, that the strongest empire is not simply the one that wins the most wars, but the one best prepared to endure after those wars have been won. If Guilliman's philosophy had remained an ideal without manifestation, history would have forgotten it. Instead, he built Ultramar, and its significance cannot be overstated. At its height, Ultramar encompassed 500 inhabited worlds, each contributing its own industry, agriculture, knowledge, and manpower to the realm that functioned as something far greater than the sum of its parts. It was never just a collection of conquered planets, it was a vast spanning, deeply interconnected civilization. Commerce flowed freely between systems, agriculture sustained vast populations, industry supplied both civilian prosperity and military might. Worlds were encouraged to specialize according to their strengths, each becoming part of a larger network whose success depended upon cooperation rather than competition. At the center of this realm stood Guilliman's homeworld, Macragge. Far from the polluted hive worlds and decaying forge cities that would come to dominate much of the later Imperium, Macragge represented something increasingly rare. A world that was both prosperous and well-governed. Its great fortress cities and efficient institutions reflected everything Guilliman believed civilization ought to be. Here, duty was regarded as a virtue, and public service carried genuine honor. They regarded governance as sacred responsibility. Equally, the people of Ultramar looked upon them not as conquerors, but as protectors, and rulers charged with preserving the prosperity of worlds from which they themselves were recruited. This relationship made Ultramar almost unique within the Imperium. Across most Imperial worlds, the Emperor's Angels exist as legends. Entire generations live and die without ever laying eyes upon a Space Marine. Within Ultramar, however, the Ultramarines were a visible part of society. Many families could trace distant relatives who had been chosen as aspirants, and the chapter's warriors remained closely connected to the worlds they defended. The citizens of Ultramar enjoyed exceptionally rare levels of stability, education, and prosperity, Justice was administered consistently and fairly, infrastructure was maintained rather than abandoned, local governments functioned effectively beneath Guilliman's wider administration. While Ultramar remained every bit a part of the Imperium, it was actively demonstrating that humanity could achieve something far more than grueling survival. This is perhaps the single greatest misunderstanding surrounding the Ultramarines. People often assume they became exceptional because they possessed a remarkable leader, but the truth is almost the reverse. Guilliman was never the greatest warrior among his brother Primarchs. His true strength lay in his intellect, his judgment, and his extraordinary ability to build systems that could outlast the men who created them. He did not consider Ultramar his personal kingdom, but his argument, proof that civilization could prosper and endure. For decades, the Ultramarines had embodied everything the Great Crusade was meant to achieve. Across Ultramar, conquest had given way to civilization, and it seemed, if only for a fleeting moment, the Emperor's dream could truly become a long-standing reality. But the ruinous powers had other plans. When Horus turned against the Imperium, his first objective was not just to overthrow the Emperor, but also to prevent loyalist legions from coming to Terra's aid. Guilliman and the Ultramarines were among his greatest concerns. No legion possessed more warriors, commanded a greater realm, or had demonstrated such an extraordinary ability to sustain prolonged campaigns. If the 13th Legion reached Terra in strength, Horus's rebellion would highly likely be crushed. To remove them from the war, Horus laid a carefully prepared trap. On the world of Calth, warriors of the Word-Bearers, an enemy whose hatred of the Ultramarines had smoldered ever since the destruction of Monarchia decades earlier, turned upon them without warning. Summoned under the guise of a joint campaign, the two legions assembled in the same star system for the first time in many, many years. There, the Word-Bearer struck first with a meticulously planned surprise assault, devastating the Ultramarines' orbital fleet before coordinated attacks erupted across the planet's surface below. Yet, even amid catastrophe, Guilliman responded as he always had. Rather than allowing his legion to collapse into confusion, the Primarch reorganized scattered survivors into coordinated defensive pockets, restored communication wherever it could be salvaged, and gradually transformed a desperate retreat into an organized resistance. The cost, however, was almost unimaginable. Nearly half of the Ultramarines assembled at Calth were killed during the opening stages of the betrayal alone, with tens of thousands more swiftly rendered combat ineffective. Entire formations were decimated before they understood what was happening, leaving one of the greatest military forces the Imperium had ever assembled crippled in a single act of tragic but brilliantly calculated treachery. Even worse, the Traitors' War did not just come for Calth. It simultaneously engulfed the entirety of Ultramar. At the moment of their Calth betrayal, the Word-Bearers and World-Eaters, led by Primarchs Lorgar and Angron, immediately launched the Shadow Crusade, ravaging world after world across Guilliman's carefully constructed empire. Dozens of planets were laid waste, thriving populations were butchered, and much of what the Ultramarines had spent decades building was deliberately reduced to ruin. But neither Calth nor Ultramar was the true objective. The vast slaughter served as a focal point for the great warp rituals orchestrated by the Word-Bearers, initiated by First Captain Erebus as part of Lorgar's greater design. While billions perished horribly, the Word-Bearers fed the unimaginable slaughter into acts of dark sorcery that tore open the colossal warp anomaly known as the Ruin Storm. Upon its eruption, the Ruin Storm totally engulfed the eastern fringe, isolating Ultramar from the wider Imperium and rendering both warp travel and astropathic communication impossible. Trapped within this dark veil, the Ultramarines faced a multi-front nightmare. For the next year, bitter fighting continued beneath Calth's irradiated surface as survivors hunted one another. Horus's strategy had worked exactly as intended. As he marched upon Terra, the largest loyalist legion in existence found itself imprisoned behind an impassable barrier, powerless to reinforce the Emperor during humanity's darkest hour. For Guilliman, his legion's forced absence from the Traitors' assault of humanity's homeworld would be the greatest burden of the entire heresy. fostering a deep survivor's guilt the Ultramarines would never fully shake. Guilliman had spent his life constructing systems designed to preserve civilization through any crisis. Yet now, when the Imperium needed those systems most, the Ruin Storm robbed him of even the knowledge itself. He could not reach Terra, nor even learn whether Terra still existed. For perhaps the first time in his life, there was no problem he could solve, because he no longer possessed the information he needed to act. With the Astronomican's light unreachable beyond the Ruin Storm and all other communications severed, Guilliman eventually reached a grim conclusion. Terra may already have fallen, and the Emperor may already lay dead. Faced with this dark possibility, he made one of the most controversial decisions of his entire life. Rather than allowing civilization to descend into complete anarchy, he established Imperium Secundus, a temporary second Imperium centered upon Ultramar. It was never intended as an act of rebellion against the Emperor, but as an insurance policy against humanity's extinction, should the worst already have come to pass. When evidence finally emerged that Terra still endured, Guilliman dissolved the realm without hesitation and immediately resumed his desperate race to reach the throne world. However, he arrived too late. The greatest legion in the Imperium had spent the Civil War fighting with all of its strength, possessing the greatest numbers and the strongest supply lines, only to miss the single battle that would matter most. By the time the Ultramarines finally reached Terra, Horus had already fallen, Sanguinius was dead, the Emperor had been mortally wounded and permanently placed upon the Golden Throne, and the Imperium Guilliman had sworn to defend lay broken beyond recognition. In many ways, the Horus Heresy was the ultimate test of everything Guilliman believed. His legion had suffered one of the most infamous betrayals in Imperial history. He had been denied the chance to stand beside his father during humanity's final battle. And yet, despite the immense survivor's guilt that plagues them to this day, neither Guilliman nor the Ultramarines have abandoned those ideals. If anything, the Heresy convinced them more than ever that civilization could only survive if it rested upon the laurels of institutions strong enough to endure even the greatest of catastrophes. If the Horus Heresy destroyed Guilliman's faith in anything, it was the notion that even the greatest of individuals could be trusted with absolute power. His brother's rebellion had proven that the Space Marine legions, for all their brilliance, became unacceptable liabilities when turned inward. Entire sectors had burned because a single imperfect Primarch commanded a transhuman army on a scale no institution could meaningfully restrain. Guilliman refused to believe the answer was to abandon the Astartes. Instead, he resolved to restructure them. The result was the legendary Codex Astartes. Far more than a manual of war, it was a complete framework for what a Space Marine force should be. It defined battlefield doctrine, organization, recruitment, logistics, command structure, and even the conduct expected of each battle brother. Drawing upon hard-won experience from the Great Crusade and its collapse, Guilliman sought to preserve centuries of military understanding in a form that future generations could refine rather than repeat. Its most consequential reform, however, concerned the legions themselves. The Codex dismantled the remaining Loyalist legions during what became known as the Second Founding, replacing them with independent chapters of roughly 1,000 warriors. Each would be responsible for its own recruitment, training, fleet, and prosecution of war. No single commander, Guilliman judged, should ever hold enough concentrated strength to threaten the Imperium itself again. Reactions to the decree were divided. To many surviving Primarchs, it represented a necessary but deeply painful concession. Rogaldorn opposed the decision most strongly, seeing it as a dangerous weakening of humanity's primary shield, but ultimately accepted it as the only alternative to renewed internal war. Leman Russ resisted the principle, yet proved more pragmatic in outcome. The Space Wolves never fully adopted the Codex's structure, but Russ accepted that outright defiance would fracture what remained of the Imperium's unity. The Blood Angels, still reeling from Sanguinius' death and the early manifestations of their gene seed flaws, accepted the Codex less as doctrine than as necessity. It offered structure at a moment when their own identity was beginning to fracture. Jagatai Khan and Corvus Corax were more receptive. The White Scars, already built upon speed and decentralized warfare, adapted with little friction. Meanwhile, the Raven Guard had suffered such immense devastation and tragedy during the Heresy that Corax, filled with deep grief and exhaustion, accepted the decree. Vulcan of the Salamanders fundamentally opposed this dissolution in principle, but his legion had already been reduced to such small numbers during the Heresy that restructuring was unavoidable in practice. The Dark Angels formally complied under Imperial authority, but without the Alliance presence, their implementation became inward-facing and secretive, diverging in culture even as it conformed in name. The Iron Hands, shattered almost completely at Isfahan V and by the death of Ferris Manus, ultimately had no capacity to refuse either way. Broken into scattered remnants, they were reorganized into the Iron Hands chapter alongside a small number of successors. In the end, compliance was not born of consensus, but of exhaustion, and the recognition that the Imperium could not survive another breaking. Over the following 10 millennia, the Codex Astartes became the defining military doctrine of the Adeptus Astartes. Some chapters adapted it, others ignored parts of it, but few escaped its influence entirely. Following the second founding and the implementation of Guilliman's new codex, the newly formed Ultramarines chapter remained at the heart of the new Imperial Order. No longer the largest legion of the Great Crusade, they instead became something arguably even more influential. Their gene seed, regarded as among the purest and most stable ever created, formed the foundation for more successor chapters than any other first founding legion. Across the Imperium, countless Space Marines who had never set foot upon Macragge, nonetheless, traced their lineage back to Guilliman. The Ultramarines were no longer simply one chapter among many. In many respects, they had become the standard by which all others were measured. Their Primarch, however, would not remain beside them for long. Barely a century after the Horus Heresy, Roboute Guilliman led the Ultramarines against the reborn demon Primarch Fulgrim during the Battle of Thessala. There, amid the chaos of battle, the two brothers met in single combat once more. Though Guilliman was a formidable warrior by any measure, among the Primarchs, his greatest strength had always been his judgment rather than his blade. Fulgrim, by contrast, had long been counted among the Emperor's finest swordsmen, and now, ascended through the corrupting power of chaos, he had become something vastly more dangerous. Empowered by the Dark Prince Slanesh, he struck Guilliman with a demonic blade whose supernatural venom no mortal biology could hope to overcome. Mortally wounded, the Lord Commander of the Imperium collapsed before his sons could reach him. Refusing to surrender their Primarch to death, the Ultramarines carried Guilliman back to Macragge and placed him within an advanced stasis field deep inside the fortress of Hera. There, frozen at the precise instant before death claimed him, he would remain for the next 10,000 years. To the Imperium, Roboute Guilliman ceased being a living ruler of legend and instead became a sacred relic. Entire generations of Ultramarines were born, fought, and died, knowing their Primarch only as the silent figure suspended within his stasis shrine. Guilliman himself was gone. His work, however, endured. For the next 10 millennia, the Ultramarines stood along the Imperium's most steadfast defenders. They fought in countless wars against Orcs, Chaos Warbands, Eldari Raiders, Necron dynasties, and every other horror the galaxy could produce. Wherever disaster threatened Ultramar or the wider Imperium, the Sons of Guilliman could frequently be found at its center. While many chapters gradually adapted, ignored, or reinterpreted parts of the Codex Astartes, the Ultramarines remain its foremost custodians. They preserved not merely its tactical doctrines, but the philosophy that lay beneath them. That discipline, preparation, and sound leadership could allow humanity to endure even in a galaxy determined to destroy it. Across the long centuries, many legendary warriors rose through the chapter's ranks, but none became more synonymous with the Ultramarines than Chapter Master Marneus Calgar. An exceptional strategist rather than a reckless conqueror, He guided both the chapter and the realm through some of the darkest centuries of Imperial history. Under his leadership, Ultramar remained one of the few regions of the Imperium where order and effective governance continued to flourish despite the growing decay consuming the wider galaxy. It was during Calgar's tenure that the Ultramarines would face perhaps the greatest challenge since the Horus Heresy itself. In M41, strange reports began reaching the Imperium from the eastern fringe. Entire worlds had fallen silent. Colonies had completely vanished. Fleets disappeared without trace. Although the Salamanders had previously encountered the parasitic gene stealers of Mughal, the Imperium had never understood what those creatures truly represented. Unfortunately, the Ultramarines would be the first to confront a Tyranid Hive Fleet in full. An immense intergalactic Hive Fleet, later designated Hive Fleet Behemoth, emerged from the darkness between galaxies and drove directly into Ultramar. Unlike any enemy humanity had ever faced, the Tyranids did not conquer worlds for territory, wealth, or ideology. They came only to consume. Every living organism, every ecosystem, and every fragment of biomass existed only as fuel to sustain the eternal, ravenous hunger of the hive mind. And just like that, the First Tyrannic War had begun. World after world fell before the advance of Behemoth, and the Ultramarines struggled to slow an enemy whose numbers appeared literally without end. Every victory came at terrible cost, for each Tyranid slain represented a tiny sliver of a swarm that stretched across entire star systems. After consuming the neighbouring world of Prandium down to bare rock, Hive Fleet Behemoth descended upon Macragge itself. It was right here on the chapter homeworld that the Ultramarines made their stand. As Tyranid bioships descended from orbit, Marneus Calgar coordinated one of the greatest defensive battles in Imperial records. Across Macragge, Ultramarines, Imperial Guard regiments, and planetary defense forces fought desperately to prevent complete destruction of the homeworld at the heart of everything Guilliman had created. Nowhere was the fighting more desperate than within Macragge's polar fortresses. These immense bastions guarded the planet's orbital defense systems, whose guns were preventing Behemoth from overwhelming Macragge from space. If the fortresses fell, the planet itself would certainly follow. Almost the entirety of the chapter's first company, its most experienced veterans clad in revered Terminator armor, was designated to hold the northern fortress at any cost. Cut off from reinforcements, they endured an endless tide of Tyranid horrors. Carnifexes battered the walls, and monstrous bioforms poured into the fortress from every direction. Even as ammunition dwindled and the defenders were forced into brutal close-quarters combat, the Terminators refused to yield. Fighting and dying room by room, corridor to corridor, they held the fortress long enough for Macragge's orbital defense to continue firing into the Hive Fleet above. Only after the Imperial fleet shattered the remains of Hive Fleet Behemoth in orbit could relief reinforcements finally reach the fortress. Its walls still stood, but the Ultramarines' first company had been entirely extinguished. In many ways, the battle for Macragge became the defining conflict of the chapter's post-Heresy history. Just as Calth had tested their resolve during the Horus Heresy, Macragge proved that the Ultramarines remained willing to sacrifice everything to preserve the civilization entrusted to their care. They had proved that for 10 millennia, Guilliman's systems had endured. The Imperium still followed his doctrines, the chapters still fought according to his teachings, his institutions still stood, and he had achieved exactly what he'd always set out to accomplish. The tragedy was that they had endured without the man who created them, and over those 10,000 years, they had become something he would scarcely recognize. The Empire Guilliman had rebuilt after the Heresy still existed, but it had transformed into a realm consumed by dogma, superstition, and endless bureaucracy. Knowledge had withered into ritual, innovation had become literal heresy. The rational civilization he had spent his life trying to build had slowly hardened into a stagnant empire that survived not through process, but through momentum. And that momentum was waning. However, unknown to almost everyone in the Imperium, Guilliman's final plans had never truly ended. Prior to his mortal wounding at Thessala, the Primarch had entrusted Archmagos Belisarius Cawl with a monumental task. Working in absolute secrecy, Cawl was ordered to refine and expand upon the Emperor's original Astartes design to prepare a new generation of Space Marines for if the Imperium should ever face extinction. The result was the Primaris Space Marines. Taller, stronger, and equipped with newly developed war gear, these warriors represented the greatest transformation of the Astartes since the second founding itself. But they remained hidden, awaiting the moment they would finally be needed. That moment arrived during one of the darkest hours in Imperial history. The destruction of Cadia and the birth of the Great Rift tore reality itself apart, splitting the Imperium in two. As chaos engulfed the galaxy, a desperate alliance led by the Eldari Yvrain reached Macragge carrying both Belisarius Cawl's life-sustaining technologies and the ancient knowledge required to awaken Guilliman from his 10,000-year stasis. Against all expectations, the Primarch opened his eyes and awoke into a galaxy almost unrecognizable from the one he had left behind. The Emperor had become an object of worship rather than a pillar of reason. The Imperium had fractured beneath the weight of 10 millennia of war and bureaucracy. Entire sectors had been swallowed by the Great Rift, while chaos threatened humanity on a scale unseen since the Heresy. Once again assuming the mantle of Lord Commander of the Imperium, Guilliman immediately unleashed the Primaris Space Marines across hundreds of chapters and launched the vast Indomitus Crusade, seeking to stabilize a civilization standing once again on the brink of collapse. The Ultramarines themselves stood at the forefront of this new era. As the Primaris reinforcements emerged from Cawl's hidden vaults, the chapter expanded beyond anything it had been since the days of the Old Legion. Veterans fought beside newly awakened Primaris battle brothers, while dozens of Ultramarine successor chapters also received long-awaited reinforcements. Once again, the Sons of Guilliman found themselves at the center of the Imperium's greatest military undertaking. For the Ultramarines, the return of their Primarch marked the beginning of a new age. The Ultramarines are often described as the model chapter, but that reputation extends far beyond battlefield doctrine. It is reflected just as clearly in how they think, how they lead, and what they believe it means to serve the Imperium. To become an Ultramarine is not simply to master the arts of war. Each warrior is expected to embody discipline in every aspect of his life. Honor is not treated as a matter of personal reputation, but as the formation upon which trust between brothers, commanders, and the people of Ultramar is built. A warrior whose word cannot be trusted is a liability, no matter how formidable he may be on the battlefield. This emphasis upon personal responsibility shapes the chapter's approach to leadership. Rank is never viewed as a reward for courageous acts by themselves. Every officer is expected to understand strategy, diplomacy, and administration alongside the craft of war. A captain must be capable not only at defeating an enemy, but of governing worlds, directing reconstruction efforts, and restoring stability once the fighting has ended. Victory without order is considered an incomplete achievement. This expectation of excellence begins long before an aspirant ever receives the gene seed. Across Ultramar, countless youths are educated within military academies where discipline, scholarship, and public service are valued alongside physical prowess. Only the finest are eventually brought to the Fortress of Hera upon Macragge to begin the trials that may transform them into Space Marines. After their ascension, the learning never truly ends. Unlike many chapters that devote themselves almost exclusively to martial perfection, the Ultramarines place genuine value upon education beyond the battlefield. History, philosophy, statecraft, and military theory all remain worthy pursuits, for an Ultramarine is expected to understand not just how wars are fought, but why they are fought, and what must follow once they are won. This outlook also shapes the chapter's relationship with ordinary humanity. Most Space Marines exist apart from the people they protect, appearing only in moments of crisis before vanishing once more into legend. The Ultramarines, however, have governed the worlds of Ultramar for thousands of years. As a result, they often possess a stronger sense of civic responsibility than many of their brother chapters. They do not see themselves solely as warriors, but as guardians entrusted with the long-term well-being of the realm under their protection. This perspective has earned them a reputation as one of the noblest of all of the Adeptus Astartes. While utterly uncompromising towards the enemies of mankind, the Ultramarines are not needlessly cruel. They value honor not simply in battle, but in conduct, keeping their word even in dealings with unlikely allies when necessity demands temporary cooperation. Though such allegiances remain rare and often deeply controversial within the Imperium, the Ultramarines have shown themselves more willing than many chapters to recognize that survival can occasionally demand pragmatism over blind hatred. They protect rather than terrorize. They govern with fairness rather than cruelty. Under their stewardship, the worlds of Ultramar still enjoy levels of prosperity, stability, and security almost unmatched anywhere else within the Imperium. Yet, beneath that ideal lies a far more uncomfortable truth. The Ultramarines believe civilization is worth preserving almost above anything else. Not one civilization itself. To them, peace is valuable because it allows humanity to endure. Culture is valuable because it strengthens society. Governments are valuable because they maintain order. If any of those things ceased to serve the greater purpose, they will be replaced. Throughout the Great Crusade, countless worlds peacefully accepted Imperial rule. Others did not. Some simply wished to be left alone. Some possessed their own ancient traditions, religions, or systems of government that had sustained them for centuries. They were not necessarily hostile to humanity, but they refused to surrender their independence, and for the Ultramarines, that distinction ultimately meant very little. If peaceful negotiations failed, compliance followed. Their armies would conquer the world, replacing its rulers, rewriting its laws, and absorbing it into the wider structure of Ultramar. Often stability and material conditions did improve afterwards, but the civilizations that had existed before were erased. Languages disappeared, ancient customs faded, centuries of local identity were quietly swallowed by something larger. To the Ultramarines, this is not dark cruelty, it is necessity. They believe a united Imperium saves vastly more lives than 1,000 isolated worlds ever could. If the price of securing peace for billions is the loss of one world's traditions, then it is simply a price worth paying. It is a profoundly utilitarian philosophy. The happiness of the individual, the independence of a people, even the survival of an entire culture, all become secondary when weighed against the stability of humanity as a whole. There is little malice in this, little hatred, little desire to dominate for its own sake, only an unwavering belief that the needs of the many must always outweigh the needs of the few. This is the philosophy that has made Ultramar one of the greatest realms in the Imperium. It is also the reason that, for those who stand outside the vision of order, the coming of the Ultramarines can mean not only conquest, but the total erasure of everything that once made their worlds uniquely their own. If the Ultramarines possess a defining military strength, it is not that they are unmatched in any single form of warfare. Rather, it is that they are exceptionally proficient across almost every discipline of battle. Unlike the Imperial Fists, whose mastery of defensive warfare is legendary, or the Raven Guard, who specialize in stealth and infiltration, the Ultramarines deliberately avoid becoming dependent upon any single method of battle. Instead, they strive to master every aspect of warfare, believing that no commander can choose the battlefield upon which he must fight. Every campaign presents different challenges, and every enemy demands a different solution. Though still organized around the familiar 10-company structure established by the Codex Astartes, the modern Ultramarines chapter has evolved alongside the changing realities of war. The return of Roboute Guilliman and the arrival of the Primaris Space Marines expanded the chapter's battlefield capabilities considerably. Vanguard formations now fight alongside more traditional battle line, close support, and fire support elements, giving each company access to an even broader range of specialist warriors while preserving the original principles that have guided the chapter for 10 millennia. On the battlefield, this translates into an approach built upon coordination rather than individual heroics. Infantry, armoured vehicles, aircraft, artillery, and reconnaissance assets are expected to operate as parts of a single, carefully orchestrated whole. They don't rely upon overwhelming force in one area alone. Instead, the Ultramarines seek to maintain the initiative by applying the right weapon at the right place at precisely the right moment. Their battle plans naturally flow between long-range bombardment and decisive close assaults, with each preparing the way for the next in a seamless sequence of combined arms warfare. This methodical approach is reinforced by the way that Ultramarines officers are taught to think. Every tactical problem is first considered in terms of the theoretical, the ideal solution if circumstances were perfect. It is then weighed against the practical, the reality of the battlefield as it actually exists. The Ultramarines also understand that battles are often won before the first shot is fired. Reliable supply lines, accurate intelligence, disciplined communications, and meticulous operational planning are treated as weapons every bit as important as bolters or battle tanks. Over the long millennia following Guilliman's mortal wounding, however, the Ultramarines were not entirely immune to the slow drift of Imperial dogma. Many within the chapter came to regard the Codex Astartes less as a guide to independent judgment and more as an almost sacred text whose teachings should rarely be questioned. Only after Guilliman's return did the Primarch remind his sons that this had never been his intention. The Codex was written to teach commanders how to think, not to dictate what to think. Doctrine provides the foundation, but wisdom lies in recognizing when changing circumstances demand a different course of action. It is this balance that has always been reflected in the Ultramarines at their best. They are not the Imperium's greatest siege masters, finest infiltrators, or most ferocious shock troops. They are something altogether much rarer. A chapter capable of meeting almost any enemy on almost any battlefield, with a solution already beginning to take shape before the first blow is struck. The Ultramarines have produced no shortage of legendary heroes across 10,000 years of unending war. What makes these warriors remarkable is not just the enemies they have slain, but the different qualities of the chapter that they each embody. Together, they demonstrate that while the Ultramarines may share a common philosophy, there is still room within it for very different kinds of leaders. If Roboute Guilliman is the architect of the Ultramarines, then Manius Calgar is the man who preserved the Primarch's legacy throughout its darkest age. For much of the chapter's modern history, Calgar became a living embodiment of everything the Ultramarines sought to be. As Chapter Master, Lord of Macragge, and Lord Defender of Greater Ultramar, he bore responsibilities extending far beyond the battlefield. Like Guilliman before him, he was expected to win wars, but also to safeguard entire worlds. Calgar's reputation rests first and foremost upon his extraordinary strategic ability. He has never been a commander willing to squander lives in the pursuit of personal glory, understanding that victories are achieved not by heroics alone, but by the warriors who execute a carefully considered plan. His battle brothers follow him with absolute loyalty because they know that every life he spends is weighed carefully against the cost of greater victory. Yet for all his gifts as a strategist, Calgar has never hesitated to fight alongside his warriors when the decisive moment arrives. During the First Tyrannic War, he personally led the assault into a Tyranid hive ship, one of the first boarding actions of its kind ever attempted against the alien menace. Perhaps his greatest trial came during the legendary defense of Macragge itself. As the battle for the northern polar fortress reached its height, Calgar eventually found himself facing the mighty Swarm Lord in personal combat. This genius Tyranid warbeast had deliberately lured the Ultramarines into a carefully prepared trap, feigning weakness before launching a devastating counterattack. Though Calgar fought with incredible determination, he was critically wounded and would almost certainly have been slain had his honor guard not sacrificed themselves to carry him alive to an evacuation gunship. Years later, during the Battle of Ikar IV, Calgar finally met the Swarm Lord once again, and this time succeeded in slaying the monstrous creature, avenging both his fallen honor guard and the terrible losses suffered upon Macragge. Even after Roboute Guilliman's miraculous return, Calgar remains one of the most respected figures in the Imperium. For 10,000 years, the Ultramarines endured without their Primarch, and the weight of much of that endurance was carried upon Calgar's shoulders. While Calgar represents the chapter's discipline, it is Chief Librarian Tigurius who represents its pursuit of knowledge. Even among his fellow Ultramarines, Tigurius remains an enigmatic figure, possessing psychic gifts of astonishing power, and he has repeatedly demonstrated an uncanny ability to glimpse possible futures through vivid walking visions. Entire campaigns have been won because Tigurius foresaw dangers long before they became apparent to anyone else. Despite his immense abilities, however, Tigurius is defined as much by restraint as power. He believes knowledge is dangerous when pursued without understanding, often responding to questions not with answers, but with questions of his own, until those seeking his counsel fully appreciate the consequences of what they wish to know. This patient, scholarly approach occasionally frustrates the chapter's more direct-minded officers, but few can deny the wisdom of his counsel. His greatest achievements have also come against the Tyranids. Where most Imperial Psychers risk madness simply attempting to perceive the hive mind, Tigurius has repeatedly succeeded in gleaning fleeting glances of its intentions, allowing the Ultramarines to anticipate Tyranid invasions with remarkable accuracy. Few minds in the Imperium have ever ventured so close to the incomprehensible consciousness guiding the Great Devourer and returned sane. No Ultramarine has challenged the chapter's traditions more successfully than Captain Uriel Ventris. As commander of the 4th Company, Ventris repeatedly demonstrated a willingness to ignore the Codex Astartes wherever he believed circumstances demanded it. His most controversial decision came when he led a kill team into the heart of a Tyranid Hive fleet to destroy its Norn Queen, despite heavily violating established doctrine. For his repeated deviations, Ventris was stripped of his rank and exiled from the chapter under a death oath. Rather than seeking forgiveness, he accepted his punishment without complaint, completing the almost impossible missions that eventually carried him into the nightmare fortress world of Medrengard, where he helps destroy the horrific Demonculaba created by the Iron Warriors. Only after proving his loyalty and his purity was Ventris welcomed back into the ranks of the Ultramarines and restored to a position of command. His story has become one of the chapter's clearest demonstrations that the Codex is intended to guide judgment, not replace it. But where Ventris embodies independent judgment, Cato Sicarius represents another side of the Ultramarines entirely. For much of his early career, Sicarius possessed immense confidence in his own abilities, earning fame through victories such as the assault on Black Reach and numerous campaigns across Ultramar. Many believed him destined to succeed Manius Calgar as chapter master, but then came the Great Rift. While escorting Primaris reinforcements to Ultramar, Sicarius and his fleet became trapped within the warp for years, enduring horrors that stripped away much of the swagger that had once defined him. Though he eventually escaped, the experience left him profoundly changed and deeply scarred by survivor's guilt. Unable to resume his former command of the 2nd Company, the once proud, almost arrogant hero emerged as a far more humble and reflective commander. Today, as commander of the elite Victrix Honor Guard and one of Guilliman's closest companions, Sicarius demonstrates that even the greatest Ultramarines continue to learn from adversity. However, perhaps no story better illustrates the Ultramarines' internal tensions than that of Demetrian Titus and Chaplain Leandros. During the defense of the fortress world Graia, then 2nd Company Captain Titus repeatedly deviated from strict Codex doctrine in order to defeat both an Orc invasion and a Chaos conspiracy threatening the planet. His extraordinary resistance to the corrupting influence of Chaos and the Warp ultimately saved countless lives. To Leandros, however, these same events appeared deeply suspicious. Leandros believed no loyal servant of the Emperor could ever display such restraint without some hidden corruption. Convinced that Titus had somehow been tainted, Leandros bypassed his chapter's own leadership, and ironically, the dictates of the Codex Astartes, by reporting his captain directly to the Inquisition. Soon after, Titus disappeared into Imperial custody for more than a century, before eventually being released into the ranks of the Death Watch, where he served as a Black Shield. Only during the era Indomitus was he finally cleared of all accusations, crossed the Rubicon Primaris, and returned to the Ultramarines as a lieutenant in, and later again captain of, the 2nd Company. Leandros' own journey proved equally revealing. Having ascended to the rank of Chaplain, he spent Titus's return hiding his identity behind his skull-masked helm, strictly monitoring his former captain for any signs of lingering corruption. Only after the campaign's conclusion did Leandros reveal his face, making one thing unmistakably clear. Redemption does not place any warrior beyond scrutiny. Even after acknowledging Titus's loyalty, Leandros warned that should corruption ever truly take hold, he would personally carry out the execution without hesitation. Their story has become one of the chapter's most fascinating modern legends, not because either man was entirely right or entirely wrong, but because together they embodied one of the Ultramarines' oldest dilemmas. How faithfully should one follow the Codex, and when must judgment take precedence over doctrine? After everything we have explored, it becomes clear that the Ultramarines were never simply the generic Space Marines that so many imagined them to be. That reputation exists largely because their legacy became so successful that it came to define the Imperium itself. Their organization became the standard. Their Primarch's teachings became the foundation upon which most chapters were built. Their gene seed spread farther than any other, giving rise to hundreds of successor chapters across the galaxy. But their true legacy reaches even further still. Some chapters become masters of siege warfare, others perfect stealth, terror, speed, or close combat. But as we have learned, to the Sons of Guilliman, the purpose of war is not destruction for its own sake, but to create something capable of enduring long after the fighting has concluded. This philosophy shaped Ultramar into one of the greatest realms humanity has ever known. It gave the Imperium the Codex Astartes, a military framework that's guided the Adeptus Astartes for 10,000 years. It preserved order after the Horus Heresy threatened to tear civilization apart. And when the Imperium again once stood upon the brink of extinction, it was Guilliman who returned to hold it together. Without him, it is difficult to imagine the Imperium surviving at all. But as we have also seen, that vision of order carries its own cost. The Ultramarines do not merely defend civilization, they define what civilization should be. Worlds are expected to conform, traditions disappear, entire cultures are quietly erased if they stand in the way of unity, and whether that is wisdom or tragedy is left for history to decide. Perhaps that is why the Ultramarines continue to inspire such debate. They are not the Imperium's fiercest warriors. They are not its most savage conquerors, nor its most feared defenders. They are builders in a galaxy that has almost forgotten how to build. For 10 millennia, they have fought to ensure that there is still a civilization standing when humanity's wars finally fall silent. And perhaps that is the answer to the very question we asked at the beginning. Some wars are remembered for the worlds they conquered, others for the enemies they destroyed. But the Ultramarines alone remind us that victory is only the beginning. Because in the end, history is not written by those who win the war. It is written by those who survive to build what comes next.